The appeal yesterday by Just Stop Oil activists against their sentences has resulted in what can only be described as a mixed outcome at best. While 6 of the 16 appellants saw marginal reductions in their jail terms, including 1 year reduction for the movement coordinator Roger Hallam, the majority saw their appeals dismissed outright. And this ruling reinforces the trajectory of Britain's law towards harsher penalties for disruptive protest and signals a broader failure of Just Stop Oil's approach, both in activism and in legal argument. The Court of Appeal, led by Lady Chief Justice Sue Carr, considered that many of the sentences were manifestly excessive, but upheld the broader principle of deterrence through custodial sentences. And while a few adjustments were made, such as reducing Hallam's sentence from 5 to 4 years, the overriding ruling has strengthened the precedent for long-term jail sentences for non-violent but highly disruptive protests, and the decision particularly affected those involved in high-profile stunts, such as Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland, whose appeal against their sentences for throwing soup at Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers was dismissed outright. The argument that damage to a culturally significant object constitutes a form of violence was upheld, and suggests a stricter interpretation of criminal damage in future protest-related cases. And this ruling underscores the extent to which Just Stop Oil's legal strategy has been ineffective. Rather than persuading the judiciary that their actions constituted legitimate civil disobedience, the movement has found itself reinforcing the very legal precedents that they hoped to challenge. The argument that their protests should be seen in the light of the greater good, namely the prevention of climate catastrophe, has failed to gain traction with the courts. And public sentiment towards Just Stop Oil has soured considerably as their protests have become more disruptive. The group's tactics, blocking roads, targeting art, targeting theatre, causing large-scale public disruption, has drawn ire from both public and political figures, and even figures with traditionally liberal stances on civil liberties like Keir Starmer have backed tougher legal positions against protesters. Starmer's previous experience as the Director of Public Prosecutions likely informs his no-nonsense approach, reinforcing the view that climate activism must not disrupt ordinary life. And the Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick, of course, went further, saying that minor sentence reductions undermine deterrence and risk sending a dangerous message. His position reflects a growing hardline attitude within British politics towards activism and against those sort of actions that cross into public disruption. Just Stop Oil's response to the ruling has been predictably dramatic, with the group labelling it another nail in the crucifixion of justice. They've claimed that the courts have been captured by the powerful and compared their members to those who hid Anne Frank, an analogy so hyperbolic that it does little to win the group's broader public sympathy. Instead of recognising the need for a recalibration of their protest strategy, Just Stop Oil appears committed to doubling down on its current approach. While they may seek further legal recourse via the European Court of Human Rights, such an appeal risks setting a precedent that could further entrench the judiciary's position against disruptive protest in the UK. Just Stop Oil really needs to rethink what it's doing completely, because the traditional 19th century approach to protest has run its course. We need to reimagine, of course, bringing people out onto the streets, protesting against a Trump state visit. All of this is great for the cameras, but it doesn't achieve anything. If you want to achieve something, then you have to look at other resources. The internet, for example, social media, for example. You have to look at harnessing the resources that are there, writing to your MP, for example. Because in the days when people don't write letters, a barrage of letters is probably particularly efficacious. The fundamental issue with Just Stop Oil's strategy is that it confuses spectacle with persuasion. Climate change is undoubtedly and undeniably a pressing global crisis, but the movement's relentless focus on disruption rather than dialogue has alienated potential allies. The environmental movement has long thrived on a balance of activism and policy engagement, yet Just Stop Oil has largely abandoned the latter in favour of performance obstruction. If the goal is to achieve meaningful political change, if the goal is to achieve discussion, then the approach must shift towards public persuasion, coalition building, and serious policy advocacy. Otherwise, Just Stop Oil risks becoming less an effective movement for change and more an example of how protest can backfire spectacularly. In addition, Just Stop Oil needs to stop appealing to and relying on that broad coalition of people who simply enjoy activism, who would join any activist moment, any activist movement, any action. They live for action. It needs to stop appealing to those and start appealing to people who are genuinely interested in preserving our way of life, in saving our planet. The Just Stop Oil appeal has served as a stark reality check for the movement. The British legal system has reaffirmed its commitment to punishing disruptive protest, and public sentiment remains largely unsympathetic to the group's methods. If Just Stop Oil wishes to remain relevant, or wants to become relevant, it must rethink its strategy, eschewing grandstanding in favour of real engagement with policymakers and, more importantly, with the public. Otherwise, it faces a future of diminishing influence, increased legal repercussions, and growing public resentment.